He had spent 5 years hunting for her, 5 years of sleepless nights, of burning through private investigators, of torturing anyone who might know where she went. Victor Carbone, the most feared mafia boss in New York, could find anyone. Anyone except the woman who vanished from his bed one morning, leaving only her diamond ring on his pillow. And now, standing in a tiny Brooklyn bakery, he finally found her. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the 4-year-old boy who just ran out from the back room. A boy with gray eyes. Cold, sharp gray eyes. Victor's eyes. In the next 100 minutes, you will witness a story of betrayal that runs deeper than blood, a mother's desperate sacrifice, and a mafia king forced to choose between his empire and the family he never knew he had. But here's the question that will haunt you until the very end. Who was really protecting whom? And what was the terrible secret that made a pregnant woman run from the most powerful man in New York, straight into a life of poverty and fear? Stay until the end, because the truth about who really betrayed Victor will shock you. This story carries a powerful lesson about what family truly means. It is not built on power or wealth, but on the people willing to sacrifice everything for the ones they love. If you have ever faced impossible choices for your family, this story is for you. If you want to experience this journey with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a like if you are ready for a story that will stay with you long after it ends. And share this with someone who needs to hear that love can survive even the darkest betrayals. Now let us begin. A small bell above the glass door announced his entry. The warm scent of vanilla and sugar met Victor Carbone instantly. He stopped, with one polished leather shoe inside the bakery and the other on the cracked Brooklyn pavement. His men stood by the black armored vehicle, their hands near their weapons, their faces filled with confusion. For 15 years, Victor had run one of New York's most powerful crime organizations. He never personally handled details for weddings, meetings, or his hidden enterprises. But something drew him here today, an instinct he could not explain. The bakery felt small, far too small for a man who governed the shadows of half the city. Cream-colored walls were covered in pictures of happy customers and handwritten notes of thanks. A menu on a chalkboard hung crookedly by the cash register. Mellow jazz drifted from an unseen speaker, and that is when he saw her. She was behind the counter with her back to him, tying an apron. Her brown hair was in a messy bun, much shorter than he recalled. Her body was thinner now, looking almost delicate, and old bruises colored her wrists, the result of years of hard work. When she turned to grab an item from a shelf, the air left Victor's lungs. Amelia. She had not seen him. She was humming a quiet tune, lost in her task of arranging pastries. Victor's grip on the door handle grew so tight his knuckles turned white. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she disappeared from his world without any reason, without a single clue, without one word. He woke up one morning to a vacant apartment and her diamond ring resting on the pillow. He knew he should leave. He should get back in his car and let Marco handle the wedding cake order online, the way any man in his world would, but his feet were stuck to the floor. Then Amelia glanced up. Their eyes locked across the tiny room, and Victor saw all the color leave her face. The small notepad she held fell from her fingers, making a soft noise on the counter. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Before he could say anything, before the shock in his throat could become words, a child's voice came from the back room. The sound of small feet hit the old wooden floor, and a little boy ran through the doorway behind the counter. He was holding a crayon drawing in his small hands. "Mommy, Mommy." I finished the picture. The boy was maybe 4 years old. He had on a worn blue shirt that showed a dinosaur. His brown hair was a wild mess, but it was his eyes that sent Victor's world spinning. They were gray, cold, and sharp like metal, and they were undeniably his own. The boy stopped when he saw the stranger in his mother's shop. He moved closer to Amelia's leg, suddenly shy, and looked out at Victor with curious eyes that showed Victor his own reflection. Victor Carbone, the most feared mafia leader in New York, the man who ordered hits without a second thought, was frozen. He stood in a tiny bakery in Brooklyn, looking at a 4-year-old boy with his eyes, his jaw, and his blood. Everything he believed about the last 5 years was now broken into a million pieces. If you are still watching, please subscribe and turn on your notifications so you can see what happens. Hit the like button if you want to watch Victor face this new reality. Share this with anyone you know who enjoys a great mafia tale. Now, let's return to the story of Victor Carbone. 6 years before, Victor Carbone entered a little bar on the corner of Mulberry Street, and it was not for a drink. He was there to get protection money from the owner, who was 3 months late on his payments. The bar was run down, lit by a faint yellow glow, and the air was heavy with the mixed smell of old beer and cigarette smoke. Marco was a step behind him, his hand ready on the pistol hidden under his suit. But when Victor took a seat at the end of the bar, his life changed forever. A young woman came out from the back carrying a tray of drinks. Her chestnut hair was in a quick knot, with loose pieces falling on her forehead. She wore a simple white shirt and a black apron, and her body was slim. But she moved with speed and confidence. She did not notice Victor in the dark corner. She spun around too quickly, and the whole tray of whiskey spilled all over his $3,000 suit. The alcohol soaked the material, and its sharp smell filled the air. Marco jumped up, his hand going for his weapon. The entire bar went completely quiet. The owner ran out from the back room, his face pale, saying he was sorry again and again. But the girl did not apologize. She just stood there and looked right into Victor's eyes with no fear at all. "I am sorry," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But if you were not sitting in the shadows like that, I would have been able to see you." Victor had never encountered anyone who spoke to him with such nerve. He was Victor Carbone. People shook when they heard his name. They looked down when he came into a room. But this girl, with her bright green eyes and an apron wet with whiskey, looked at him like he was just another customer in her way. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Marco threatened. "Your boss is about to lose his whole business because of what you did." The girl looked at Marco for a second, then back at Victor. "I do not care who he is. I am a waitress. I spilled a drink. I said I was sorry. If he wants me fired, fine, but I will not get on my knees and beg for anyone." Victor just watched her, feeling something new stir inside him. He knew hundreds of women, the most beautiful, the most influential, the richest. They all pursued him for his money and his power. They offered sweet smiles and kind words, ready to do anything to get his attention. But this girl was not like them. She had no idea who he was. And if she did, she likely would not care. In her green eyes, Victor saw no fear and no greed. He saw the dignity of a person with nothing more to lose. "What is your name?" Victor asked, and his voice softened on its own. The girl lifted an eyebrow, surprised. "Amelia? Amelia Weston. And who are you that makes this whole bar act like you are a tiger?" Victor smiled for the first time in years. A genuine smile. "It does not matter. You owe me a new suit, Amelia. I will be back to get it." He got up and left the bar, leaving Marco shocked and the owner sighing with relief. On the drive back, Marco asked if he should burn the place down. Victor just shook his head. "No, let it be. I am going back." And he did. He went back the next day, and the day after that. For 3 weeks straight, he sat in that same corner, ordered a whiskey he never touched, and just watched the girl with brown hair as she moved around the old tables. She smiled at the customers, but she never smiled at him. Amelia Weston did not know that the man in the corner every night was New York's most dreaded mafia boss. She only knew that he stared at her with a weird expression in his eyes that made her uneasy. And Victor Carbone, for the first time, did not know how to win over a woman. She did not want his money, his influence, or anything else he had. She just wanted him to leave her alone in the bar. Victor did not quit. He was not a man who ever took no for an answer, not from business opponents, his enemies, or a stubborn waitress. In the fourth week, he started leaving tips that were 10 times the bill. Amelia gave back every last dollar. In the fifth week, he had flowers delivered to the bar. Amelia handed them out to the customers. In the sixth week, he purchased the entire bar and cleared the old owner's debt just so Amelia would not get fired for rejecting him so many times. When Amelia learned what he had done, she confronted him after work, her green eyes full of rage. "Do you believe you can own me?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you think that just because you have money, I will fall for you like all the others? I know who you are now, Victor Carbone. Everyone in this area knows you are a killer, a crime boss, the darkness that everyone fears. I would rather starve to death than be involved with you." Victor just stood there, speechless for the first time in his life. He was used to being feared, hated, or used. He was not used to a woman looking him directly in the eyes and telling him she would rather die than have him. Victor could not sleep that night. He sat in his fancy penthouse high above New York City, thinking about the girl with green eyes and a spirit that could not be broken. He thought about what she said, and he knew she was right. He was a killer. He was the darkness. He did not deserve someone as pure as Amelia Weston, but Victor Carbone did not know how to give up. He only knew how to chase what he wanted. He stopped the flowers, the big tips, and all the grand displays. Instead, he just went to the bar every night. He sat in his corner, ordered his whiskey, and he read a book. He did not look at Amelia, or talk to her, or do anything at all. He just sat there quietly, as if he belonged there. A month went by. Amelia started to get curious. She would sneak glances at him when she thought he was not looking. She saw him reading books on history, philosophy, and art. She saw him smile as an old couple danced together to a slow jazz tune. And every night, she saw him put money in the donation box near the register, time he left. She started to see a different Victor Carbone. He was not the cold mafia boss people whispered about, but a lonely man trying to prove he was more than darkness. One rainy night, with the bar almost empty, Amelia sat across from Victor. She said nothing. She just watched him. Victor watched her back. For 10 minutes, they sat in complete silence. Finally, Amelia asked, her voice as soft as a breath, "Why do you not just give up?" Victor shut his book and looked straight into her green eyes. "Because I never met anyone who made me want to be a better person. Not until I met you." They talked that night until the bar was closed. Victor told her about growing up without a father, about a mother who was always cold, and about being forced into the underworld as just a teenager. Amelia told him about the orphanage, about the years of abuse, and about her dream to open her own small bakery. They came from two separate worlds, but they both carried scars that no one else could see. Their love story started that night. It was secret, dangerous, and forbidden. Victor found a small apartment in Brooklyn, a place far away from his mafia empire and any watching eyes. They would meet there in the deep hours of the night when the city was quiet. Amelia showed Victor how to bake. Victor showed Amelia how to dance. They shared laughter. They shared tears. They loved one another as if there was no tomorrow. A year went by like a beautiful dream. Then, on a winter night, with white snow falling past the window, Victor got down on one knee in front of Amelia with a diamond ring in his hand. He wanted to marry her. He wanted her to be his wife in front of everyone, no matter what it would cost him. Amelia cried and nodded her head, and the ring slid perfectly onto her finger. They had no idea their happiness was being observed. They had no idea that darkness was waiting right outside the door of that tiny apartment. And they did not know that the most powerful woman in the Carbone family was aware of everything. And she would never let her son marry a girl from an orphanage with no name. Catherine Carbone never allowed a single thing to occur inside her empire without her knowledge. She had spies positioned everywhere. In each corner of New York, in every dark crack of the criminal world, when her son started staying out late at night, when he began to smile for no clear reason, When his expression softened in a way she had never witnessed, she knew something was deeply wrong. She gave the order for Victor to be followed. The report they brought back left her seething with fury. Her son, the man who would inherit the Carbone empire, the strongest mafia boss in New York, had fallen in love with a waitress from a rundown bar. She glared at the secret photographs. Victor and Amelia taking a walk in a park. Victor gently kissing Amelia on the forehead outside a small apartment. Victor on one knee, proposing to her with a diamond ring. She threw her wine glass against the floor. Shards of glass flew in every direction. This was an insult. This was a deep humiliation to the entire Carbone family name. Catherine demanded a full investigation into Amelia Weston. In less than 48 hours, a thick file was on her desk. She went through every single page, and each one filled her with more and more disgust. Amelia Weston, delivered in a public hospital in Queens. Her mother, a prostitute addicted to drugs. Her father, completely unknown. Her mother died from an overdose when Amelia was just 3 years old. She was placed in St. Mary Orphanage, where she lived for the next 15 years. The records indicated she had been harmed by one of the staff, with scars on her back as the evidence. She walked out of the orphanage at 18 without a single thing. She had no education, no family, and no future. She took any job she could find to stay alive. Washing dishes, mopping floors, serving tables, cleaning toilets. She was a nobody. She was absolutely nothing. And this was the girl her son wanted to make his wife. Catherine stood at her window, looking out over the city, her eyes as cold as ice. She had dedicated her whole life to creating this empire. She had put up with an abusive husband. She had survived wars with other families. She had given up everything to put her son at the very top of power, and now Victor was ready to throw it all away for some worthless girl from an institution. She would not permit it. Catherine summoned her most loyal followers. She had devised the perfect plan. That Amelia girl would simply vanish, and Victor would never learn what really happened. But before she put her plan into action, she needed to see for herself the woman who dared to capture her son's heart. She needed to understand exactly the kind of person she was facing. 1 week later, Catherine arrived at the bar where Amelia was working. She had on a sophisticated black dress and a pearl necklace worth a fortune, entering the rundown bar like a queen visiting a slum. Amelia was wiping a table clean when Catherine took a seat. She looked up and gave a polite smile, the same smile she offered every guest. "Would you like to order anything?" Catherine looked her over from head to toe with pure contempt. She saw the diamond ring on Amelia's finger, the one her son had purchased, and anger burned inside her. "You are Amelia Weston," Catherine said. It was not a question. It was a declaration. The orphan from St. Mary. Your mother was a prostitute. Your father was a nobody. You have nothing. You are nothing. And you actually believe you are good enough for my son. Amelia stood completely still, the color draining from her face. She knew who this woman was immediately. The cold gray eyes, the sharp bone structure, the way she stared down at her as if she were an insect. This was Catherine Carbone, Victor's mother, the most feared woman in the New York underworld. "I am here," Catherine went on, her voice sounding sweet but filled with poison. "I know every detail about you, Amelia. I know you were hurt at the orphanage. I know you had to steal bread just to eat. I know you do not have a single dollar to your name. Do you actually believe you can show up here, charm my son, and rise to the position of the lady of the Carbone family? You are gravely mistaken." Catherine rose to her feet, moved closer to Amelia, and dropped her voice to a whisper. "You will leave my son. You will vanish from his life, and you will never return. If you fail to follow my instructions, I will guarantee you disappear in a different manner, a permanent one." She spun around and walked out, leaving Amelia shaking inside the empty bar. The diamond ring on her finger suddenly felt like a heavy weight, like a curse. And Amelia understood that from that point on, the clock was ticking on her happiness. 2 weeks after her meeting with Catherine at the bar, Amelia found out she was pregnant. She sat on the floor of the small bathroom in the apartment, looking at the two red lines on the test while tears rolled down her cheeks. They were tears of pure joy, but also tears of pure terror. She knew Catherine would never allow this. She knew that woman would do anything to prevent it, but she also knew she was in love with Victor and wanted this baby to protect the proof of their love. Amelia made a decision to tell Victor that very night. She would tell him that she was carrying his child, that they were about to start a family, and that no one could ever pull them apart. She prepared his favorite meal, lit some candles, and waited for him. But Victor never arrived. He called her to explain that there was an emergency, a critical meeting with the other families, and that he needed to leave town for several days. He apologized and swore he would make it up to her as soon as he got back. Amelia told him she understood, told him she would be waiting, keeping the secret safe in her heart until his return. She had no idea that this was the very chance Catherine had been waiting for. That night, while Amelia was asleep, a series of violent bangs hammered against the apartment door. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. Before she had time to move, the door was kicked off its hinges and 4 men dressed entirely in black rushed inside. They were huge, looked ruthless, and they were holding guns. Amelia screamed and tried to make a run for the window, but one of them seized her by the hair and threw her down to the floor. She lay there shaking, her hands automatically moving to cover her stomach to protect the unborn child growing inside her. At that moment, Catherine entered. She was wearing a black fur coat, her gray eyes were as cold as a winter storm, and she had a smile on her face that Amelia would never be able to forget. It was the smile of a person who controlled both life and death. "I did warn you," Catherine said, her tone light, almost like they were having a casual chat. "I offered you a chance to walk away, but you chose not to listen. You believed your love was powerful enough to defy me. You were wrong, you foolish girl." Catherine gave a signal, and one of the men pulled Amelia up to her feet and shoved her hard against the wall. The cold metal of a gun barrel was pressed to her temple. Amelia cried, her whole body trembling, but she made herself not scream. She refused to let Catherine see just how terrified she was. "You think I did not know?" Catherine moved closer, her eyes dropping to Amelia's stomach with pure disgust. "You are carrying my son's child, a child of mixed blood from a worthless orphan." "Did you really think I would ever permit that to happen?" Amelia sobbed, her voice shaking badly. "Please do not harm my baby. I will do anything you ask. Please, my child has done nothing wrong." Catherine let out a laugh, a chilling sound that echoed in the small apartment. "Anything? Good. Then this is what you are going to do. You will leave New York this very night. You will disappear from my son's life for good. You will not contact him, not look for him, and not ever tell him about this child. And if you do exactly as I command, I will allow you and the child inside of you to live." Catherine dropped an envelope on the floor in front of Amelia. It contained $5,000 and a one-way bus ticket to any destination she wanted. "This is everything you deserve. An orphan like you should feel lucky that I am even letting you live." "And if I refuse?" Amelia asked, her voice just a faint whisper. Catherine tilted her head to the side and smiled. "If you refuse, you will die tonight, and the child inside of you will die as well. I will personally see to it that no one ever finds your body. Victor will believe you abandoned him. He will think you betrayed him, that you were only after his wealth. He will grow to despise you, and then he will erase you from his memory. No matter what you choose, the result is identical. You will disappear from my son's existence. The only variable is if you are living or not." Amelia squeezed her eyes shut as tears streamed down her face. She pictured Victor, his smile, the feeling of his arms around her each night, and the promises they had whispered in the dark. A part of her wanted to resist, to shout, to tell him what was happening. But she glanced down at her stomach, at the new life stirring within her. She could not endanger her child. She could not allow her baby to perish before it could even see the world. "I will leave," Amelia whispered, her voice shattering along with her heart. "But please, allow me to leave one thing for him, something to show Victor I did not want to go." Catherine paused to think, then gave a slight nod. "You may leave the ring, just that. No note, no words, no reason." That evening, Amelia left the diamond ring on the pillow where Victor's head would normally rest. Her eyes swept across the tiny apartment where they had built their love and planned their future. Then she walked out into the biting cold of the night. One hand protected her belly, while the other clutched an envelope filled with cash. She had no destination. She had no idea how she would make it on her own. Her only certainty was the need to shield the child inside her, whatever the price, even if it cost her love, her joy, and her entire world. Amelia got on a late bus headed for Philadelphia. From there, she went to Baltimore, and then from Baltimore she circled back to New Jersey. She moved like a hunted creature, never staying anywhere for long, terrified that Catherine would track her down. The $5,000 ran out in just 2 months. She managed to find a small, cheap room in a corner of Brooklyn, far from any place Victor would ever visit. She got a job as a waitress in a little diner, using a baggy apron to conceal her expanding stomach. She was on her feet for 12 hours every day. Her legs swelled and her back throbbed with pain, but she never dared to take a day off. A day without work was a day without money for food. In the quiet of the night, she would lie in the cold, damp room with one hand on her belly, speaking softly to her unborn baby. She would tell the child about his father, a man with serious gray eyes and a smile that was rare but incredibly kind. She made a vow to her child that whatever came next, her love would be strong enough for the both of them. Amelia delivered her baby in a city hospital during a fierce rainstorm. Complications during the birth required surgery, and she lay on the operating table completely alone, with no family there to hold her hand. When the doctor finally laid the newborn in her arms, Amelia's composure broke and she began to sob. The baby boy was so small, his face was flushed, and his eyes were sealed shut. But when he finally opened them, Amelia found herself staring into a pair of familiar gray eyes. They were Victor's eyes. She decided to name him Ethan, Ethan Weston, because she was too afraid to give him the Carbone name. After giving birth, Amelia was forced back to work in only 2 weeks because the hospital charges were mounting. She paid an elderly neighbor a small amount to watch Ethan, then raced to the diner for her morning job, to the laundromat for her afternoon job, and to a bar for her night job. She worked 3 jobs, a total of 20 hours each day. Her sleep was limited to 4 hours at most. Her body began to fail her. The weight fell off of her, and deep dark circles formed under her eyes. But every single time she gazed at Ethan, she discovered the will to continue. When Ethan turned 2, her landlord started to bother her. He would show up at her door late at night, suggesting she could pay her rent in other ways if she was short on money. Amelia always said no, so he kicked her and her son out onto the street in the dead of winter. She held Ethan close, walking through the freezing air with nowhere to turn. That was the night she found Father Thomas. The old priest from St. Michael's Church saw the mother and child shivering on the church steps and brought them inside. He gave them a small room behind the sanctuary at no cost, only requesting that Amelia help keep the church tidy when she had the time. Father Thomas never questioned her history. He did not judge her or offer pity. He just provided quiet, steady help, like a silent protector. But her run of bad luck was not over. When Ethan was 3, he started to complain of chest pains, found it hard to breathe, and his lips would turn a frightening shade of blue. The doctors gave her a terrible diagnosis. He had a heart defect from birth and needed an immediate operation, or he would not survive. The surgery would cost $150,000. It was an amount of money Amelia could not hope to make in her entire life. She took out loans from dangerous people, fully aware that the interest rates would ruin her, but she saw no other path. She used the loan money for Ethan's medication, which bought her a little more time as she hoped for a miracle. With the small amount left over, she started a little bakery, praying it would bring in more money. The shop was in a struggling part of town where there were very few customers, but it represented her only hope. 5 years. For 5 years, Amelia endured a living nightmare. For 5 years, she pushed her body past its limits, wept in private every night, and saw her son become increasingly frail while she was powerless to stop it. For 5 years, she guarded the truth about Victor, about his powerful family, and about the diamond ring she left behind. For 5 years, she prayed, not for herself, but only for Ethan. She pleaded with God to spare her son, to make him well, and to grant him a future. Then, one completely normal afternoon, the bell on the bakery door chimed. Victor Carbone stepped inside. 5 years of hiding, 5 years of running, and 5 years of secrets all came crashing down the moment his gray eyes met hers. Back in the present time, after that shocking meeting in the bakery, Victor was unable to think clearly. He sat in his car and told Marco to just drive, letting the city blur past as his thoughts raced with 1,000 questions. That boy was his son. He was as certain of it as he was of the air in his lungs. The gray eyes, the structure of his face, the way the child tilted his head when he was curious. It was all a reflection of him. But why did Amelia not tell him? Why did she conceal his own child for 5 years? Why did she walk away without a single word of explanation? At precisely 7 that evening, Victor stood at the rear entrance of the bakery, just as Amelia instructed. He had come by himself. Marco was not there, he had no security, and he carried no weapon. For the first time in 15 years, he was exposed on a Brooklyn street with nobody to watch his back. He did not care. All he wanted were answers. Amelia pulled the door open, her expression as hard and cold as a statue. She offered no greeting, just moved to the side so he could enter. When Victor stepped inside, his heart seized at the sight of where his son lived. The entire space was smaller than the master bathroom in his penthouse. A single narrow bed was pushed flat against a wall, its bedding old but spotless. A small area was dedicated to a handful of cheap plastic toys, their colors faded from use. The walls were a gallery of crayon art, filled with drawings of stick people, houses, and smiling suns. One picture showed two figures, one tall and one small, with shaky letters underneath that spelled Mommy and Me. There was no father in any of the drawings. Victor stood frozen in the center of the room as a sharp pain twisted in his chest. His child, the boy who would inherit the Carbone fortune, was living in this tiny room. He played with used toys while Victor slept in a mansion that cost millions and traveled the city in armored vehicles. "Where is Ethan?" Victor demanded, his voice strained. "He is sleeping in the other room." Amelia crossed her arms over her chest, keeping a safe distance from him as if she feared his touch. She had been working all day and had no energy left for a fight, but she knew this conversation had to happen. Victor spun to look at her, his gray eyes blazing with intensity. "Explain. Why did you disappear? Why did you hide our son from me? Have you any idea how long I searched for you?" "I hired private investigators. I offered huge rewards. I turned this entire city upside down looking for you, and you were here, in Brooklyn, less than a 20-minute drive from my home." Amelia let out a bitter laugh that sounded like it was filled with tears. "You were searching for me. You really were. Or did you simply accept what your mother told you? That I was a fraud? That I ran off with your money?" Victor went completely still. "My mother? Do not act like you knew nothing, Victor." Amelia's voice trembled as 5 years of suppressed anger surged forward. "Did you actually think I wanted to leave you? Did you think I wanted to have our baby all by myself in a public ward? Did you think I wanted to work 3 different jobs every day, get threatened by my landlord, be thrown out on the street, and watch my own son get sicker while I had no way to pay for his care?" "What is wrong with Ethan?" Victor interrupted, his voice laced with a sudden, sharp panic. "He has congenital heart disease," Amelia stated, and every word was like a knife. Did you know? The question stabbed Victor like a knife. He needs an operation right away. It costs $150,000. I went to loan sharks. I sold my own blood. I did everything possible just to afford his medicine. Every day, I am terrified Ethan will not survive the night. And what about you? Where have you been? You were busy choosing wedding cakes for someone else. The world fell out from under Victor's feet. His son had a heart defect. His son could die at any second, and for 5 years he knew nothing. He had been kept completely in the dark. Why did you never tell me? Victor demanded, his voice cracking. Why did you not call me, or write, or do anything to let me know he existed? Amelia stared at him, her green eyes blazing with years of pain and anger. Because your mother held a gun to my head. She swore that if I ever tried to contact you, she would kill me and she would kill my child. Victor stood frozen, as if lightning had struck him. All sound in the tiny apartment faded away. His mother. His own mother had done this. No. The word was a faint whisper. That is not possible. My mother would never do that. Amelia's voice was like ice as she cut him off. She arrived at our apartment with 4 bodyguards. She pressed the cold metal of a gun against my temple. She was fully aware I was pregnant with your child, and she promised that if I did not vanish from your life, she would end both of our lives. She gave me $5,000 and a bus ticket, tossing them at me like I was a dog on the street. She called me a worthless nobody. She said I was not fit to carry the Carbone family name. But do you want to know the one thing she was right about, Victor? She told me you would always pick your family over me. And for 5 years, every single day, I wondered if it was true. I asked myself, if I had told you what happened, would you have protected me? Or would you have trusted your mother, just like you always did? Victor stumbled backward until his back hit the cold wall. It felt like all the oxygen had been stolen from his lungs. Memories shattered and spun in his head. The day he came home to a vacant apartment, the diamond ring left on the pillow, the agony that ripped him apart. And then his mother was there holding him, telling him Amelia had just been using him for his money, that she had been paid to leave. She told him to forget her and to focus on his real family. And he believed her. He had believed every single word. He needed a reason to survive, and his mother gave him a perfect one. It was all a lie. I searched for you, Victor said, his voice shaking. For the first 2 years, I did nothing but search for you. I brought in the best private investigators. I burned through millions of dollars, but it was like you had disappeared from the earth. That is because your mother paid them to fail, Amelia answered, her voice dripping with bitterness. Do you have any idea why I could live right here in Brooklyn and never be found? It is because Catherine Carbone owns this city. She knew exactly where I was for all 5 of those years. She just made sure you never would. Victor's legs gave out, and he slid down the wall to the floor. He sat there, clutching his head between his hands. The most feared Mafia boss in all of New York looked like a broken child, betrayed by the one person he was supposed to trust completely. 5 years, he whispered to himself. For 5 years, I hated you for abandoning me. For 5 years, I believed you were the one who betrayed me. For 5 years, I tried to erase you from my memory, and I failed every time. And this entire time, my son was growing up without a father. He had a bad heart and lived in poverty, all while I was living in a mansion worth millions, without a clue that he was even alive. Amelia looked at him, and for the first time in 5 long years, she did not see the ruthless Mafia boss. She saw the man she fell in love with, the same man who had gotten on one knee in the falling snow and asked her to be his wife, and he was shattering right in front of her. She felt an urge to go to him, to comfort him like she used to. But 5 years of pain had constructed a wall between them that was just too high. Does Ethan know who I am? Victor asked, looking up, his gray eyes swimming with agony. Does he know that I am his father? Amelia just shook her head. He asks me about his dad every single day. Every morning on the way to school, he sees the other kids getting dropped off by their fathers, and he always asks me where his daddy is. I never know what to tell him. I just say that his daddy is far, far away and cannot come home yet. He draws pictures for me every day, and he always leaves a blank space next to me and him, like he is saving a spot for someone to come and fill it. Tears began to stream down Victor's face. It was the first time he had cried in 15 years. He just wept. He cried for the 5 years that were stolen from him. He cried for the son who had to grow up poor and without a dad. He cried for the woman he adored who had to suffer all by herself. He cried for the ultimate betrayal from his own mother, the woman who took his family from him and let him live in a world of darkness and lies. Just then, the door to the bedroom creaked open. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes barely open with sleep, holding a well-loved teddy bear. "Mommy," I heard someone crying. Amelia immediately rushed to his side and knelt down to his height. "It is all right, my sweet boy. Mommy just has a visitor. You should go back to bed." But Ethan's eyes had already found Victor sitting on the floor, and they grew wide. "It is the man from the bakery," Ethan said, his voice soft with sleep but filled with curiosity. "Who are you? Why are you crying? Are you feeling sad?" "Whenever I am sad, my mommy gives me a hug, and it makes me feel better." "Do you want me to give you a hug?" Victor stared at the 4-year-old boy in front of him. The boy had the exact same gray eyes as his own, and was offering him comfort with pure, childish innocence. And Victor's heart, which had been hardened by years of violence and blood, broke into a million pieces. Victor departed from the bakery just before midnight, after Amelia had settled Ethan back into bed. He did not say goodbye. He just gave her one final look, his eyes full of anguish, and vowed that he would be back. He needed some time. He needed his own proof. He had to be absolutely sure that every word Amelia spoke was the truth before he faced his mother. On the drive home, Victor called Marco. His voice was as cold as steel, completely empty of any emotion. "Get to the penthouse immediately, and bring only the men you trust with your life. We have some work to do." An hour later, Marco and 3 of Victor's most trusted soldiers were sitting in his office. They all watched their boss with a sense of dread, because they had never seen him look like this. His eyes were red, his jaw was set like stone, and his entire body radiated a calm fury that was far more frightening than any open rage they had ever seen. "I have a job for you," Victor stated, his voice dangerously level, like he was holding back a hurricane. "I need you to look into something. 5 years ago, on the night that Amelia went missing, someone visited our apartment. I have to know who it was, what kind of car they drove, what they did, and what they said. Find every security camera, track down any witness, find me anything. And I need the complete medical history of a child. His name is Ethan Weston. He is 4 years old, and he lives in Brooklyn." Marco gave a sharp nod, not daring to ask a single question. He understood that this was a time for silence and total obedience. 24 hours later, Marco came back carrying a briefcase filled with papers. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed the case on the desk. "Boss," he said, his voice rough, "I have everything you asked for, but I do not think you are going to like any of it." Victor flipped open the briefcase. The very first thing he saw was a photograph taken from a security camera at the building where he and Amelia used to live. The image was blurry, but it was still sharp enough to make out a familiar black limousine parked on the street at 11 o'clock at night. It was his mother's car, on the exact night that Amelia had vanished. The next item was a written statement from the building's doorman, who had since retired and moved to Florida. Marco had found him and convinced him to speak. The man confirmed that 4 men in black suits came into the building with an older woman. They went up to Victor and Amelia's floor, were there for about 30 minutes, and then they left. The woman had paid him a lot of money to forget everything that he saw. Following that was the final report from the private investigators Victor had hired 5 years ago. Marco had investigated their financial records and found a massive wire transfer from Catherine Carbone's private bank account. The payment was dated exactly 2 days after Victor had hired them. They had accepted her money to stop looking for Amelia and to tell him that she had simply disappeared without a trace. Victor examined every single page, his hands starting to shake, a vein throbbing at his temple. Every word Amelia had told him was true. His own mother had planned the entire thing. She had forced away the only woman he had ever loved. She had concealed the fact that he had a son, and she had paid people to make sure he would never find them. 5 years. For 5 years his mother had watched him hurt, she had pretended to comfort him, and she had lied to his face, all while knowing exactly where Amelia was. She knew that his son was alive and living in poverty. "There is one last thing, boss," Marco said, passing Victor a medical folder. "The boy's health records." Victor opened it, and the blood in his veins turned to ice. Ethan Weston, age 4, was diagnosed with congenital heart disease at the age of 3. The medical report was a death sentence. A hole in the boy's heart required an immediate operation. Without it, his heart would fail. He had less than 2 years to live. The surgery cost $150,000. The bill was marked unpaid. The child was on a waiting list. Victor's eyes scanned the notes. The mother had asked to delay the surgery again and again. She did not have the money. Medicine was keeping the boy stable, but it was not a solution. The doctors urged surgery within 6 months to prevent the worst. He dropped the file and closed his eyes. His son could die. He could die while Victor sat on hundreds of millions of dollars, completely unaware of his existence. Amelia had fought to save their child all alone. She borrowed from loan sharks. She sold her own blood. She did whatever it took. At the same time, he was choosing a wedding cake for another woman. Victor rose and went to the window. He looked down at the glittering lights of New York City. Somewhere out there, his son was sleeping in a small room over a bakery, his heart slowly giving out. And in a mansion in Manhattan, his own mother was sleeping without a care, not knowing that every one of her crimes was about to come into the light. The next morning, Victor went to his mother's home on the Upper East Side. He did not call first. He did not bring his bodyguards. He carried only a briefcase filled with proof. The guard at the gate tried to block his path, but the look in Victor's eyes made the man retreat without a word. Victor entered the mansion. He walked directly to the breakfast room where Catherine sat with her morning tea, just as she always did. She wore a silk dress the color of pearls, her hair perfectly in place. She was the image of a high society woman with no worries at all. She smiled when she saw Victor and lowered her cup. "My son, what are you doing here at this hour? Is there something important?" "We are done pretending, Mother." Victor tossed the briefcase onto the table, and papers flew everywhere. "I know what you did." Catherine looked. She saw the documents scattered on the table, photos from security cameras, statements from witnesses, financial trails. She showed no surprise and no fear. She simply took another slow sip of her tea. Then she set the cup down with a terrifying calm. "So, you met the girl?" she said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "I always knew this day might come. That girl has a name. Mother." Victor's jaw was tight. "Her name is Amelia. And my son's name is Ethan. He is your grandson, the one you let suffer in poverty for 4 years." Catherine stood up and walked to the window. She looked out at her perfect garden, not at her son. "I did what I had to do to protect our family." "Who is this Amelia, Victor?" "She is a nameless orphan, the daughter of a prostitute, raised by the state. She has no education, no family, no value. She would have been your greatest weakness, a stain on the Carbone name. Our enemies would have used her to destroy you, to humiliate you. I could not let that happen. You held a gun to the head of the woman I love." Victor moved closer to her, his voice shook with the rage he was fighting to control. "You threatened to murder her and my unborn son. You forced her away when she was pregnant. You knew for 5 years that I had a son, and you said nothing." Catherine finally turned to face him, her gray eyes as cold as ice. And I would do it again, she said. There was no regret in her voice. Do you believe I did this because I disliked the girl? I did this because I love you. I have spent my whole life building your power, making you the head of this empire. I will not allow some worthless orphan to tear it all down. Worthless? Victor laughed. The sound was raw and broken. She raised my son by herself for 4 years. She worked 3 jobs. She went to loan sharks. She sold her own blood to afford his heart medication. She is stronger than anyone you know. And you? You are a coward. You used money and guns to threaten a pregnant woman who had no one to protect her. Is that how you protect this family? Watch what you say, Victor. Catherine's voice became sharp. I am still your mother. You have no right to speak to me that way. You gave up that right when you sent Amelia away, Victor said. His voice was now quiet and cold. I will never forgive you for what you did. Not ever. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she watched him. She could see he was serious. She saw the decision in his eyes, but she was not a woman who gave up easily. What will you do? She asked him. End your engagement with Alexandra. Destroy the alliance with the Benedetti family. Do you understand what will happen? Don Benedetti will not accept this insult. He will start a war with us. You will lose half of our support, half of our land. You will make the Carbone family a target for all of our enemies. And why? For a nameless girl and her illegitimate child. That illegitimate child is your grandson, Victor said, his voice like steel. That child has Carbone blood, and I will not let my son grow up without a father like I did. I will end the engagement. I will bring Amelia and Ethan to live here with me. And if Don Benedetti wants a war, then he will get one. Catherine looked at Victor. For the first time, she saw something in him that had never been there before. Defiance. He was rebelling. The son who had always done as she asked, who had always followed her plan, was now choosing a woman over her. If you do this, she said very slowly, you will stand alone. I will not save you from what comes next. I will not support you when it all falls apart. You will lose me, Victor. I already lost you 5 years ago, Victor answered as he turned to leave. I just did not realize it until today. He walked out of the mansion and did not look back. Behind him, Catherine stood at the window, her eyes narrowed with cold purpose. She did not accept defeat. If Victor refused to listen, she would find another way. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew well. When a voice answered, her own was like ice. I have some information you may find useful. It is about Victor Carbone and his weakness. After the fight with Catherine, Victor did not go home. He drove directly to Amelia's bakery. He stood outside the door for a long time before he finally knocked. Amelia opened the door. She saw him standing there, his eyes tired but full of resolve. I want to see my son, he said. Please, Amelia, just give me one chance. Amelia studied him for a long moment, then she moved aside to let him in. From that day forward, Victor came to see Ethan every single day. He did not come in an armored car with a team of guards. He drove a normal car, parked it blocks away from the bakery, and walked the rest of the way like any other man. In the beginning, Ethan was timid. He would hide behind his mother and just stare at the stranger. But Victor was patient. He sat on the floor, down on the child's level, and asked Ethan if he wanted to watch him draw. He drew a dinosaur that was so bad it made Ethan laugh out loud. The ice between them started to crack. The next day, Victor brought a box of new crayons. They were not the cheap ones Ethan was used to. This was the best set, with 72 colors. Ethan looked at the box like it was a chest of gold, his eyes wide. Uncle Victor, it has a gold one, he yelled, showing him the shiny crayon. Mommy, look, it is gold like the sun. Victor watched his son examine the box with pure joy. A warmth filled his chest that he had not felt in his 15 years as a Mafia boss. On the 3rd day, he brought a giant teddy bear. On the 4th, a jigsaw puzzle. On the 5th, a toy car. Amelia tried to say no to the expensive presents, but she could not do it when she saw how happy Ethan was. The little boy had never owned so many toys. He had never had someone bring him gifts every day. And Victor. Victor learned to smile again when he was with Ethan. It was not the cold smile of a crime boss. It was a real smile. It was the smile of a father. After 1 week, Ethan stopped calling him Uncle Victor. The boy would run to the door at the sound of the knock. He would wrap his arms around Victor's legs and yell, "Victor is here! Victor is here!" They would sit on the floor and draw together. Their pictures were clumsy, with golden suns and a house with 3 people in front. Ethan drew himself in the middle with Mommy on one side. On the left, a tall man stood on the right. Underneath, Ethan had written, "Victor." The empty spot in Ethan's drawings was finally filled. Amelia watched them from the doorway of her tiny kitchen. She saw Victor, the man feared by all of New York, lying on the floor so Ethan could ride on his back like a horse. She saw him pretend to be hurt just to hear Ethan laugh. She saw him gently wipe Ethan's runny nose, his movements awkward but surprisingly tender. And her own heart, which had been frozen solid by 5 years of pain, began to slowly melt. One evening, long after Ethan was asleep, Victor sat at the small kitchen table. He watched Amelia as she washed the dishes. "Does he know that I am his father?" he asked, his voice a soft whisper. Amelia stopped what she was doing but did not turn around. "He knows a man comes to see him every day. He knows that man loves him. For now, that is enough. We will tell him the truth when the time is right." Victor nodded, even though she could not see him. "I have spoken with the hospital," he said. "The finest surgeons in the city are going to operate on Ethan. I have already covered all of the expenses. He is going to be fine, Amelia. I give you my word." Amelia stood completely still, her shoulders shaking. She refused to turn around, not wanting Victor to witness the tears that were now flowing freely down her cheeks. For 5 years, she had carried this burden by herself. For 5 years, she had gone to sleep every night terrified that her son would not live to see the morning. And now, in a single week, Victor had accomplished what she had failed to do for 4 years. She despised herself for the gratitude she felt. She despised the way her heart was beginning to soften toward him. But she was powerless to stop it, because every time she saw Victor holding Ethan, every time she heard her son's happy laughter echo in the tiny room, she was reminded of why she had ever loved this man. And she was terrified that she was starting to fall in love with him all over again. 2 weeks after Victor started his daily visits with Ethan, it felt like things were finally improving. The doctors set a date for Ethan's surgery at the end of the month, and the little boy already seemed healthier. But fate is rarely kind to those who have already suffered so much. It was too much to bear. That afternoon, Ethan had been drawing at a table in the bakery when he abruptly went still, his face draining of all color. "Mommy, my chest hurts," he murmured, his little hand grabbing at his shirt. "I cannot breathe." Amelia ran to his side. Her own heart felt like it stopped beating when she saw his lips were turning blue. The boy suddenly fell to the floor. His eyes were clamped shut and his body began to shake. Amelia let out a scream and fumbled for her phone to call an ambulance, her hands trembling so hard she could barely dial the numbers. She gathered her son into her arms, feeling the frantic, weak fluttering of his heart against her hands. "Ethan, look at me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You need to breathe. Do not leave Mommy. Please do not leave Mommy." The ambulance showed up in under 10 minutes, but for Amelia, it was the longest 10 minutes of her entire life. Paramedics moved Ethan to a stretcher and placed an oxygen mask over his small face, working quickly against the clock. Amelia rode in the ambulance, clutching her son's hand, her eyes fixed on the chaotic lines of the heart monitor. With her other hand, she called Victor, her voice breaking with terror. Just strangled cries came through the phone. "Ethan, hospital, heart." Victor needed no more information. He was in a meeting with his men when Amelia's call arrived. He leaped from his chair, sending furniture crashing as he sprinted from the room like a man possessed. He threw himself into his car and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The vehicle tore through the congested New York streets as if traffic signals were invisible. Red lights, angry horns, the curses of pedestrians, he registered none of it. The only thing in his mind was the sound of Amelia's shattered voice and the haunting image of Ethan lying still on the ground. 20 minutes. Victor made the drive from Manhattan to Brooklyn in 20 minutes, a journey that broke every speed limit and countless traffic regulations. He abandoned the car directly in front of the emergency room, not even pausing to lock it, and burst inside like a caged beast. He shoved aside anyone who stood in his path, screaming Ethan's name until a nurse finally guided him toward the intensive care unit. Amelia was waiting outside the closed doors. Her face was a ghostly white, and tears flowed down her cheeks in endless streams. The moment she saw Victor, she fell into his arms, her body racked with tremors. "He's inside," she cried. His heart gave out in the ambulance. They used the paddles to bring him back. "Victor, he cannot die. He cannot die." Victor wrapped his arms around Amelia, feeling her tremble like a leaf in a hurricane. He had no words of comfort. He had no idea what to do. For the very first time, the most feared Mafia leader in New York was utterly and completely helpless. He could order a man's death without a flicker of emotion and command a vast criminal network. But he was powerless to help his own son, who lay just beyond those doors. 2 hours later, a doctor emerged. "The boy is stable for now," he announced, his voice weary but hopeful. "But his cardiac condition is exceptionally severe. We have to perform surgery immediately. We cannot afford to wait until the end of the month. The expense will be considerable, and there are major risks." "Do it," Victor said without a single moment of hesitation. "Whatever my son requires, whatever the price, I will pay it. Bring in the finest surgeons. Secure the best technology. The cost does not matter. Just save my son." That evening, after Ethan was settled in the recovery ward, Victor remained at his bedside all through the night. He never once stepped away. He sat there, clutching Ethan's tiny hand, observing the shallow rise and fall of his chest under the thin hospital blanket. Wires and medical equipment covered the child's small body. The only noise in the room was the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Victor studied his son's face. That little face, with his eyes squeezed shut, was stained with silent tears. 4 years. For 4 years the boy had lived, and Victor had never known. For 4 years, the boy had been fighting a brutal heart condition without his father there to support him. And now, he could lose his son before he ever had the chance to tell him he was his father. For the first time in his 36 years, Victor Carbone prayed. He did not know the right way to pray or what to say to a God he never believed in, but he shut his eyes, gripped his son's hand tighter, and murmured into the quiet, "Please, let my son survive. I will do anything. I will sacrifice anything. Just give my son a chance." From across the room, Amelia was curled into a small chair, watching Victor pray over Ethan's bed. She knew then that whatever came next, she would not face it by herself. As Victor kept his vigil at Ethan's bedside, Catherine Carbone was in her study, examining a photograph sent by her informant. The picture showed Victor holding Amelia outside the emergency room, his expression a mask of terror and devotion. Catherine gritted her teeth so hard that her nails dug into the surface of the oak desk, carving deep marks into the wood. Her son had made his choice, and she had been defeated. But Catherine Carbone was not a woman who knew how to accept defeat. She had warned Victor of the consequences, and he had refused to listen. So, she would demonstrate precisely what those consequences entailed. She lifted the telephone and dialed the exact number she had called after her argument with Victor the week prior. A gruff man's voice answered on the other end. "Mrs. Carbone, it is an honor to hear from you." "I have the information you need, Tony," Catherine said, her voice as cold as steel. "The location of the woman and the child. And I know when Victor is scheduled to leave the hospital." Tony Moreno was sitting in a derelict warehouse on the edge of New York, and a vicious smile crept across his features. He was the mortal enemy of the Carbone family, the man Victor had crushed and relieved of half his territory 5 years before. He had been biding his time, waiting for an opportunity for revenge. And now, that opportunity was being served to him on a platter by his adversary's own mother. "What do you want for this?" he asked, skeptical that Catherine would betray her own son for nothing. "I want the girl, Amelia, to vanish from this world," Catherine answered, her tone absolute. "But you will not harm the child. He has Carbone blood." Tony let out a sharp, cruel laugh that bounced off the warehouse walls. "Of course, Mrs. Carbone. I will handle the girl for you." But he was not telling the truth. Tony Moreno never planned to take only Amelia. He wanted something more. He wanted Victor brought to his knees. He wanted to watch the most arrogant mafia boss in New York plead for the lives of the people he cherished. The child was the perfect tool for that. After he finished the call with Catherine, Tony called his men, 12 of his most dedicated enforcers, men who would kill on command. He unrolled a map of Brooklyn on a table, circling the location of Amelia's bakery, the hospital where Ethan was, and the typical routes Victor used. "Victor Carbone has a weakness," he declared, tapping the map. "A woman and her child. We are going to take them both, and when Victor comes for them, he will give me what I want. The Eastern Territory, a complete list of his operations, and perhaps his own life." His men began to laugh, their voices filling the shadows. They had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The plan was meticulous. They would wait for Ethan to be released. Wait until Victor felt that the danger had passed. Wait until he let his guard down. That is when they would make their move. Back at the hospital, Victor was completely unaware of the darkness gathering around him. He stayed by Ethan's bed, watching his son's gradual recovery after a successful operation. The doctor explained that Ethan would require several more days to stabilize, and Victor had already posted guards outside the room, but he did not realize that the most significant threat was not lurking in the city streets. The most significant threat was his own mother, who sat in her opulent mansion, awaiting news that her son had been ruined. Catherine stared out her window, her gray eyes frigid and devoid of remorse. She convinced herself she was acting in the best interest of the Carbone family, to protect the honor of their name. But she knew the real reason deep inside. She was doing this because she could not tolerate losing her authority over her son. She was motivated by arrogance and the need for control. It was the cruelty of a mother who never understood how to love. And her betrayal was about to unleash a chain of events so horrific that even she could not imagine them. 5 days following the surgery, Ethan was cleared to leave the hospital. The boy was still frail, but he was much improved. His gray eyes shone with excitement at the idea of going home. Victor's plan was to take the mother and son to his mansion, where the security was unparalleled, with guards on duty 24 hours a day. But Amelia declined. She insisted on going back to the bakery, a place that Ethan knew well, a place he associated with safety. She did not want to plunge her son into Victor's world so soon. Victor gave in against his better judgment, but he demanded that 2 of his men stand guard outside the bakery. When Amelia agreed, a small part of the weight on his shoulders lifted. He had no way of knowing it was the final choice they would make before everything went dark. That night, an emergency forced Victor to leave. The police had raided one of his warehouses, and he was needed to handle the fallout. He placed a kiss on Ethan's forehead while the boy slept and promised Amelia he would return as quickly as possible. He did not know the raid was a setup. It was a perfectly staged diversion, designed to pull him away from the bakery at the precise moment Tony needed him gone. 2 hours after Victor's car pulled away, the bodyguards outside the bakery were neutralized without a sound. Suppressed rounds struck their heads before their hands could even reach their weapons. Amelia was in the kitchen, lost in a book, when a peculiar noise came from the front of the shop. She got up to investigate, and her blood ran cold when the front door was kicked from its hinges. 4 men in black stormed inside, their faces hidden and their hands holding guns. Amelia did not scream. She spun around and sprinted for the back room where Ethan was fast asleep. A mother's instinct is more powerful than any fear. She had to save her son. She needed to get him out, but her attackers were quicker. One of the men caught her by the hair, yanking her back and throwing her to the ground. Amelia fought back, clawing and biting at the hand that held her down. She snatched a cast-iron skillet from the stovetop and swung it with all her might into another man's face. As blood sprayed, she fought like a cornered animal protecting its cub, utterly fearless and refusing to yield. But there were too many of them, and they were far stronger. A vicious punch landed on her temple, making her stagger as her vision swam. She struggled to get up, but a kick to her midsection sent her collapsing back to the floor. They struck her and kicked her until she was just a motionless shape on the kitchen tiles, her face covered in her own blood. "Mommy." Ethan's shout echoed from the back room. "Mommy, I am scared." Amelia fought to open her eyes, to crawl toward the sound of her son's voice, but her body refused to obey. She could only lie there, completely helpless, as one of the intruders entered Ethan's room and dragged her terrified boy out. Ethan screamed and struggled, crying out for his mommy over and over. When he saw his mother lying broken on the floor, his cries became desperate sobs. "Mommy, wake up! Mommy, please do not die! I am so scared." "Mommy," a voice gave an order. "Take them. Be careful with the boy. He is our insurance policy." They forced Amelia into a large sack and tossed her into a truck as if she were luggage. Another man carried Ethan, who was still crying his mother's name. His voice faded away as the truck sped off into the darkness. The small bakery was left in absolute silence, its door hanging broken, the furniture toppled over, and blood staining the floor. Outside, the two dead bodyguards lay with their eyes open, staring blankly at a sky with no stars. And across the city, Victor Carbone was dealing with a fake police raid, completely unaware that his entire world had just been stolen from him. Victor got back to the bakery at 3 in the morning after resolving what turned out to be a simple misunderstanding with the local police. He had been fighting a terrible feeling all night, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. When his car pulled up and he saw the bakery door swinging open and the bodies of his men on the pavement, his heart felt like it stopped beating. He leaped from the car and bolted inside, and his reality shattered. The bakery was destroyed. Chairs and tables were overturned. A dark smear of blood covered the kitchen floor. Amelia was not there. Ethan was not there. They were gone. Victor fell to his knees, his hand landing in a pool of drying blood, and a raw scream erupted from his throat. It was the sound of a wounded beast, of a man who had lost his entire reason for living. Marco rushed in behind him, his face turning pale at the scene of devastation. He had never witnessed Victor like this, on his knees in the middle of the chaos, his entire body shaking. "Boss, your phone," Marco said quietly. "You have a message." With trembling hands, Victor took the phone. It was a text from an unknown number with a video file attached. He hit play, and the sight on the screen turned his blood to ice. Amelia was on a cold concrete floor, her hands bound behind her face a mask of blood and bruises. Her lips were split, and one eye was swollen nearly shut, but she stared back with exhaustion and defiance. She did not cry or beg for mercy. Behind her, in a shadowy corner, Ethan was curled into a ball, his arms wrapped around his knees as he sobbed. The boy kept calling for his mommy, his voice hoarse from crying. Then, a new face filled the screen. It was Tony Moreno. He offered a cruel smile, his eyes shining with pure hatred. "Carbone, it has been a long time," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I seem to have something of yours, a woman and a child. If you want to see them breathing again, you know what I want. The Eastern Territory, all of it. I want your entire list of contacts, every connection, every single warehouse. You have 48 hours. If you try anything clever, I will start sending you the boys' fingers, one by one." The video cut to black. Victor remained frozen, staring at the blank screen, his hand tightening around the phone until the plastic cracked under the pressure. 48 hours. He had 48 hours to get Amelia and Ethan back. But giving up the territory and his whole network would be a death sentence for hundreds of people in his organization. It meant sacrificing families, children, and men who had pledged their lives to him. He could not trade their lives for his. But he could not let Amelia and Ethan die either. "Find them," Victor ordered, his voice as cold as a grave and heavy with the promise of violence. "Use every asset we have. I want to know where Tony is holding them in the next 24 hours, and I want to know who gave Tony the information. Someone on the inside betrayed us." Marco nodded and left to follow the commands. Victor remained alone in the wrecked bakery, his eyes fixed on Ethan's crayon drawings taped to a wall. They showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. He would find his family, he would bring them home, and he would personally end the life of every single person who had laid a hand on them. 12 hours later, Marco returned with news that hit Victor like a physical blow. "We traced the calls made to Tony Moreno's phone," Marco reported, his voice hesitant. "Boss, this is not what you want to hear. The calls were made from your mother's estate. There were 2 of them. The first was 2 weeks ago, and the second was right before the kidnapping." Victor stood completely motionless as all the color drained from his face. He remembered the fight with his mother, her chilling warning, and the ice in her eyes when she promised there would be consequences. It was an unthinkable betrayal. His mother had sold her own grandson, and the woman her son adored, to a bitter rival. She had put Ethan's life into the hands of a murderer simply to punish Victor for defying her. "Is that everything?" Victor's voice was hollow. Marco swallowed hard. "Our source inside Tony's crew confirmed it. Catherine Carbone ordered Tony to eliminate only Amelia, to leave Ethan unharmed. But Tony has no intention of honoring that deal. He's using them both to control you, and once he has what he wants, he will kill them both." Victor shut his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. When he opened them again, his gaze was colder than the grave. "Find Tony's location," he commanded, each word a block of ice. "Gather every man loyal to me. We are bringing my family home. After that, I will handle my mother." 20 hours after the ransom video arrived, Victor knew precisely where Tony was holding Amelia and Ethan. It was an abandoned warehouse on the edge of New Jersey, roughly a 1-hour drive from the city. His informant confirmed Tony had about 15 gunmen protecting the location. Every single one was a cold-blooded killer. Victor did not care. He would eliminate each of them himself if that is what it took. At midnight, Victor's procession of vehicles headed for the warehouse. He had 20 men, the most devoted soldiers of the Carbone family, all armed with heavy weaponry and prepared to die for their leader. But Victor always led from the front. He never hid behind his men or let others fight his battles. This was about his family. This was his fight. They parked about 500 meters away and moved forward under the cover of darkness. Victor gave the signal for his men to fan out, surrounding the building from all sides. He checked the pistol in his hand, chambered a bullet, and walked directly toward the main gate. He had no need for stealth. He wanted Tony to know he was here. The first shot cracked through the night air as a guard saw Victor approaching. The round tore through his suit jacket and grazed his shoulder, but Victor did not break his stride. He returned fire twice, and the guard crumpled to the ground with a bullet hole between his eyes. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Blinding muzzle flashes sliced through the darkness. The screams and moans of the wounded filled the night. Victor's men surged forward from every angle, engaging Tony's crew in a brutal firefight. Blood spilled onto the dirt as bodies dropped. But Victor's focus never wavered. He advanced toward the main building, taking down anyone who got in his way. A bullet ripped through his upper left arm, soaking his sleeve in blood, but he registered no pain. The only agony he felt was the thought of Amelia and Ethan trapped inside that place, terrified and waiting for him. Victor kicked the warehouse door off its hinges and entered, his weapon raised. The space was nearly pitch black, illuminated by just a few dim, hanging bulbs. He heard Ethan crying from the far end of a long corridor, and his heart seized in his chest. He ran toward the sound, dispatching 2 more gunmen as he went. And then he saw them. Amelia was on the concrete floor, her hands still tied, her face marked with dried blood, but her eyes were open, and they were fixed on him. Ethan was huddled in a corner, sobbing. The moment the boy saw Victor, his eyes went wide with hope. "Victor!" Ethan cried out. "Victor is here to save us!" Victor started toward them, but a cold laugh from behind him stopped him in his tracks. How very touching, Carbone. Tony Moreno emerged from the shadows, his pistol aimed squarely at Victor's head. The most ruthless mafia boss in New York has such a tender spot. Who would have guessed? Victor turned slowly to meet his enemy's gaze. Tony looked rougher than Victor recalled, his face a roadmap of scars from his life in the criminal underworld, but his eyes held the same wild, vicious light. "Drop the weapon," Tony commanded, "or the girl gets it first." He shifted his aim to Amelia, his finger tightening on the trigger. Victor glanced at Amelia, then at Ethan, and finally back at Tony. He let his gun clatter to the ground and slowly raised his empty hands. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "You have won." A smug grin spread across Tony's face as he moved closer. He never saw the knife Victor had concealed in his sleeve. The instant Tony was within reach, Victor moved like a viper. He struck Tony's arm, deflecting the gun just as it fired, the bullet screaming past his ear. In the same fluid motion, Victor unsheathed the knife and plunged it deep, straight into Tony's gut. Tony let out a guttural scream and staggered, trying to aim his weapon again. Victor kicked the gun from his grasp, lunged forward, and began striking his face with relentless fury. Blood splattered and bones broke, but Victor did not stop. He rained down blows until Tony's features were unrecognizable, until the man beneath him was limp and motionless. Finally, Victor stood, his breathing ragged, and looked down at the broken man at his feet. "You touched my family," Victor said, his voice as cold as steel. "Death is too merciful for you." He nodded to Marco, who had just entered the room. "Lock him away. I have other plans for him." Then Victor spun around and rushed to Amelia and Ethan. He sliced through the ropes on Amelia's wrists and gathered her into his arms, feeling the tremors that racked her body. Ethan scrambled over and wrapped his arms around both of them, his cries muffled against them. They clung to one another in the center of a warehouse filled with dead bodies and the sharp smell of gunpowder, but none of that mattered. They were alive. They were together. And Victor would never allow anyone to separate them again. Victor sank to his knees, next to Amelia. His hands trembled as he sawed through the coarse ropes that had dug into her wrists for so many hours. Her skin was chafed raw and caked with dried blood. As the final piece of rope fell away, Amelia fell into his embrace, her entire frame shaking with violent sobs. Victor held on to her, not caring that the blood from his own wound was staining her clothes, ignoring the reek of violence that hung in the air. The only thing that mattered was that she was alive. She was safe in his arms. "I am sorry," Victor whispered into her hair, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am so sorry I failed to protect you. I am sorry for all of it." Amelia could not speak. She just held him tighter, her tears cutting paths through the grime on her face. She had been so sure she was going to die in this place. She had been certain Ethan would be forced to watch his mother's murder. But Victor had come. He had saved them. "Mommy!" Ethan's voice was a small, trembling sound. Amelia turned instantly, opening her arms for him. Ethan rushed to her, burying his face in her shoulder as he sobbed without restraint. He clutched her neck, his small body shaking as his broken cries filled the quiet space. "I was so scared, Mommy," Ethan wept. "The men were hurting you. I called your name, but you wouldn't wake up. I thought you were dead. Mommy is okay, my sweet boy." Amelia rocked him gently, kissing his hair over and over. "Mommy is right here. I am not going anywhere." Ethan lifted his tear-stained face and looked at Victor, who was still kneeling beside them. His gray eyes were swollen and red, but a new light of understanding shone within them. "Mommy told me," Ethan said in a soft voice. "She told me that Victor is my daddy. When the bad men came for us, Mommy held me close and said my daddy would come and save us. She said I should not be afraid because my daddy would never let anything happen to me." Victor's gaze shot to Amelia, his eyes filled with shock and overwhelming emotion. Amelia gave a small nod, fresh tears tracing paths down her cheeks. She had told Ethan the truth in their most desperate moment, when she believed they would not make it out alive. She had wanted her son to know his father, even if just for a moment before the end. "And Daddy did come," Ethan continued, his gray eyes locked on Victor's. "Daddy saved Mommy and me. Daddy hurt the bad men. Daddy is my hero." Then the boy released his mother and did something Victor never thought he would experience. Ethan wrapped his small arms around Victor's neck, holding on with all his might as if he feared Victor would vanish. "I love you, Daddy," Ethan whispered in his ear. "Daddy, please do not leave again. Please stay with me and Mommy forever, okay?" Victor was frozen. His body felt completely numb. In his 36 years of life, he had taken lives, held the power of life and death, and made an entire city fear his name. But he had never, not once, felt anything like this. He had never been loved so unconditionally, been needed so completely, been called Daddy by such a small, innocent child. Tears streamed down Victor's face. It was only the second time he had ever cried, and both times had been for this 4-year-old boy. He hugged Ethan tightly, using his other arm to pull Amelia in, creating a circle of protection around the two most precious people in his world. "Daddy promises," Victor vowed, his voice shaking but firm. "Daddy is never going anywhere again. I will stay with you and Mommy forever. I will protect you both until my very last breath. No one will ever be allowed to hurt you again. No one." The three of them held each other in the dark, silent warehouse. Three people from entirely different worlds, separated by 5 years of deception and pain, had finally found their way back to each other. In the distance, the wail of ambulance sirens grew louder. Victor's men were securing the area, but none of them dared to enter and disturb the scene. Marco stood watch at the entrance, his own eyes misty as he watched his boss, the most feared man in New York, weeping in the arms of a small child. 3 days after the rescue, with Amelia and Ethan safely at Victor's estate under heavy guard, Victor called a meeting of the most powerful Mafia families in New York. It was a summit he had delayed for far too long, a confrontation where he would finally face the consequences of all his past decisions. The meeting was held at a refined Italian restaurant in Manhattan, a neutral ground where the Dons frequently met to resolve critical issues. 7 families were represented by 7 bosses around a long table. 2 guards stood behind every leader. Don Benedetti faced Victor, his eyes like frozen lakes. Next to her father, Alexandra trembled with a rage she could barely control. Catherine Carbone was also there, positioned at the table's far end. She sat with a straight back and a high chin, as if she had committed no wrong. Victor rose to his feet, and the attention of the entire room shifted to him. He set a briefcase down, unlocked it, and pulled out several folders. He passed one to each Don. "I called this meeting to reveal the truth," Victor announced, his voice filling the space. "The real reason I ended my engagement to Alexandra Benedetti, and the truth about the crimes of someone within my own family." Don Benedetti scanned the papers, his brow tightening. "What is the meaning of this?" "This is evidence," Victor said, his gaze moving across the room. "It shows that 5 years ago, my mother, Catherine Carbone, threatened to murder the woman I loved. She also threatened the son I never knew she was carrying. She pressed a pistol to a pregnant woman's temple and sent her away with $5,000 and a bus pass. Then she hired investigators to ensure I could never locate them." Catherine jumped up from her chair, her face losing all its color. "Victor, you have no authority to do this." "I am not done," Victor interrupted, his tone as cold as steel. "When I finally found my family 3 days ago, my mother did something far worse. She reached out to Tony Moreno, a rival of the Carbone family. She gave him the location of my son and his mother. She delivered her own grandson to an enemy." A heavy silence settled over the room. The Dons exchanged looks before turning to Catherine with new expressions. In their world, family was sacred. To betray your own kin to an adversary was a sin that could not be forgiven, a mark that would never fade. That is a lie, Catherine shrieked, her features contorted by fury. All of it is lies from that orphan girl who tricked my son. She— This is the recording of your phone call with Tony Moreno, Victor stated as he played the audio. Catherine's voice echoed through the room, sharp and undeniable. I possess some information that might interest you regarding Victor Carbone and his vulnerability. Catherine was paralyzed as the blood drained from her face. She could no longer deny it. The voice was hers. The words were hers. Her offenses were exposed before the 7 most influential men in the city. Don Benedetti shut the folder and stared at Victor with an unreadable look. So, you broke the engagement with my daughter over an illegitimate heir and some unknown woman. I broke the engagement because my heart belongs to someone else, and I cannot marry another, Victor answered, his voice steady and strong. I understand this might provoke a war between our families, but I will not build my future on deceit. My son is entitled to a proper family, not a political arrangement. Don Benedetti remained quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming softly on the table. Alexandra opened her mouth to speak, but her father gestured for her to be silent. You are a brave man, Don Benedetti said at last. You stand here and publicly shame my daughter, shattering an alliance our families spent 2 years building. You are aware I could start a war at this very moment. I know, Victor responded, and I am ready for the consequences, but I trust you will see what my mother has done, and recognize I had no alternative. Don Benedetti looked from Catherine to Victor. He thought for a second, then stood. There will not be a war, he declared, his voice full of authority. Not because I excuse this insult, but because I do not align myself with those who betray their own blood. Catherine Carbone has broken our most sacred code. The alliance is over, but there will be no conflict. However, Victor, you are now in my debt, and I will come to collect one day. He strode from the room, and Alexandra trailed behind him, never once glancing at Victor. The other Dons departed one after another, giving Victor nods of a new respect. They saw a man prepared to defy his own mother, ready to give up a powerful union for his real family. In their reality, that was uncommon. Finally, only Victor and Catherine were left. She glared at her son, her eyes filled with absolute hatred. You have ruined everything, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You have ruined all that I have built. No, mother, Victor said as he turned his back and left. You ruined yourself. A week after that summit, the Dons met again to pass final judgment on Catherine Carbone. Victor had not called this meeting. It was a united decision by the council, as betraying one's family for an enemy was an offense against the entire underworld. Without a proper punishment, others might feel they could do the same without reprisal. Catherine was escorted before them. She no longer wore fine silk gowns or expensive pearl necklaces. She was in a plain black dress, her hair unpinned and loose on her shoulders. Silver strands were visible in the light. For the first time, Catherine Carbone appeared as just an old woman, stripped of all her influence and power. Victor sat at the far end of the table and observed his mother. His eyes were completely empty of any feeling. He had shed all his tears and spent all his rage. Now, only a void remained. The woman before him was once his mother, had once comforted him as a child, had taught him to navigate this cruel world. But that same woman had also robbed him of 5 years of joy, had threatened his love with death, and had sold her own grandson to a foe. Don Benedetti rose and delivered the council's decision. Catherine Carbone, you have broken our most sacred law. You betrayed your own flesh and blood and conspired with an enemy to hurt your family. The council has chosen to remove all your power and position within the Carbone family. You will be sent to a remote location to live out your remaining years alone. You are forbidden to contact anyone in this community and are forbidden to return to New York. Any violation of these terms will result in an immediate death sentence. Catherine stood there, her posture still erect, her chin still high, But Victor noticed her hands were shaking just a little. She did not beg or ask for mercy because she knew it would be pointless. In their world, the council's word was final. "You will come to regret this," Catherine said, her voice remaining cold even as she faced exile. "The Carbone family will fall apart without me. Victor will ruin everything for some orphan girl and her bastard. The Carbone family will endure," Victor said as he stood up and moved to face his mother for the last time. "But it will not be because of you. You taught me that family is the most important thing. But you never grasped what that meant. Family is not about power, or status, or pure bloodlines. Family is about the people who love you without condition and who protect you no matter the cost. Amelia and Ethan are my family. You were never truly part of it." Catherine stared at her son, and for a fleeting moment, Victor saw something different in her eyes. It was not remorse or pain, but a profound disappointment. She had wagered everything on controlling her son, and she had lost. "I made you," she said, her voice like a tired breath. "I made you the most powerful boss in this city, and this is my reward." "You made a man who did not understand love," Victor corrected her. "But Amelia and Ethan taught me there is a better way to live. I will not be like you, Mother. I will not trade my family for influence. That is what separates us." He turned his back and walked out without a second glance. Two guards led Catherine from the room to a waiting vehicle. It would take her to a small house in a secluded area, hundreds of miles from New York, where she would spend the rest of her life in isolation. Victor drove home to his estate in a silent, empty state of mind. As he walked through the door, Ethan ran to him, wrapping his small arms around his legs. "Daddy is home," the boy yelled, his gray eyes bright. "Daddy, look at what I drew. That is Daddy, that is Mommy, that is me, and that is a big house too." Victor scooped his son up and studied the charmingly crooked drawing of three figures in front of a house. He looked over at Amelia, who smiled at him from the kitchen doorway, and Victor knew, in that moment, that while he had lost a mother, he had gained a true family. 3 months after Catherine's banishment, Victor's life was completely different. He still managed the Carbone Empire, but he no longer worked for 18 hours a day. He came home to eat dinner with Amelia and Ethan, read his son stories before bed, and woke each morning to the sound of the boys' laughter filling the home. Amelia had opened her bakery again, this time in a much better part of town. Victor had quietly made sure it had the best equipment, but she insisted on paying the rent herself, determined to succeed through her own efforts. Victor admired her even more for that, for the pride and resilience she maintained through all her hardships. One autumn evening, as golden leaves carpeted the garden and Ethan slept soundly in his room, Victor took Amelia out to the balcony. He got down on one knee, presenting her with a red velvet box. A diamond ring sat inside. It was not the same one from 5 years ago, but a new one, plainer, yet holding so much more significance. "6 years ago, I asked you something, but model. I never got to fulfill my promise," Victor said, his voice shaking just a little. "So today, I want to ask you again. Amelia, will you become my wife? Not for alliances, and not for power, but because I love you. I have loved you since the moment you spilled that drink on my suit and looked at me like I was a complete stranger. I loved you through 5 years of being apart, even when I was trying so hard to forget you. And I will love you until the day I die." Amelia was crying, tears flowing freely down her face, but she was smiling. She nodded her head. With hands that trembled from happiness, Victor slid the ring onto her finger. They embraced under the light of the moon, two souls who had been through hell and finally found their way home to each other. Their wedding took place 1 month later in Father Thomas's small church, the very same place that had given Amelia and Ethan sanctuary in their darkest time. There were no hundreds of guests, no media, and no extravagant displays. Only their closest friends and family were there. Marco stood with a few loyal men. Father Thomas officiated, and a small group of friends Amelia had made were there to witness. Amelia wore a simple white gown with her hair down and no fancy jewelry, but in Victor's eyes, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Ethan was dressed in a tiny suit, carrying a velvet pillow that held their wedding rings, and he walked down the aisle with the seriousness of a grown man. When Father Thomas asked Ethan if he would serve as a witness for his daddy and mommy's wedding, the boy yelled, "I do," which made everyone in the church laugh. Victor's voice cracked as he spoke his vows. "I was a man who lived in darkness. I did not believe in love, and I did not believe in family. But you changed all of that. You and Ethan gave me a reason to be a better man. I promise to protect you, to love you, and to be by your side for all of my days." Amelia said her vows as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You once came into my life like a hurricane and tore it apart. But you were also the only shore I ever wanted to come back to. I have been waiting 6 years for this day. I forgive you, Victor, and I promise to love you until my last heartbeat." They exchanged rings and shared a kiss, and Ethan rushed forward to hug them both, shouting, "Now we are a real family, 1 year." After the wedding, their world had transformed completely. Victor remained the head of the Carbone family, but he had slowly pulled back from the criminal underworld to concentrate on legitimate business ventures. He was determined to build a clean future for Ethan, a life where his son would not have to grow up in the same shadows that he did. Amelia continued to run her bakery, which was now one of the most popular shops in Brooklyn. She brought on more employees and grew the business, but she still made time to personally bake the treats her customers adored. She never needed Victor's money. She only needed him. Ethan was now 5 years old, happy and full of energy after his heart operation had been a success. He attended kindergarten, made new friends, and his drawings no longer had an empty spot next to his mommy. Now, every picture he drew showed 3 people, Daddy, Mommy, and Ethan, standing together in front of a large house with a brilliant yellow sun shining down on them. One evening, the family was relaxing in the living room, and Ethan was nestled between his parents, asking for a story before bed. Victor told him a tale about a prince who lost his princess and their young son, but in the end, he found them again, and they all lived happily ever after. "Daddy, that story is about us, isn't it?" Ethan murmured, his eyelids heavy with sleep. "It is, my son," Victor whispered, kissing his forehead. "It is exactly about us." Once Ethan was dreaming, Victor and Amelia sat near the window, gazing at the lights of New York City. "Do you ever regret it?" Amelia asked softly. "All the things you sacrificed?" Victor turned to his wife, a gentle smile on his face. "I lost a powerful connection. I lost the approval of my mother. I lost a grand wedding celebration. But think about what I found. The most courageous woman I have ever met, a beautiful son, and a true family. It is the greatest exchange I have ever made." Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in quiet comfort, watching the city sparkle. 2 souls from separate worlds, once broken by 5 years of suffering and deception, had finally discovered their own peace. And in another room, a 5-year-old boy slept soundly, a smile on his face as he dreamed of the family he had wished for during 4 difficult years. This journey shows us that family is not built on influence or status, but on the people who love each other without condition. There are times when the most heroic act is to defend the people you love, even when you must stand against the entire world. It also shows that it is never too late to start over, to offer forgiveness, and to build a new life. If you have journeyed with us to the end of this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on your notifications so you never miss another heartfelt tale. Please like this video and share it with the people you care about to help this message of love and family reach others. We would be honored to hear your reaction to the story of Victor and Amelia. Have you ever been forced to make a hard decision for your own family? Do you feel that love can triumph over any challenge? Please share your experiences in the comment section below. We sincerely read and value every thought that you share from your heart. We hope that everyone watching this finds good health, much joy, and lasting peace in the days to come. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again for the next video.